It was just another quiet evening when my world turned upside down with a single message. "I'm leaving, it's over," from my husband, and not just that, he'd run off with my best friend. The words struck me like a lightning bolt, yet I sat there, silent as the night, signing the papers he slid across the table. Our cozy home, once filled with laughter, suddenly felt colder than a Missouri winter. I told no one a word, just watched the door close behind him and began to count the days to something better. Real quick, if you enjoy stories where karma finally clocks in, hit subscribe. We've got a lot of those around here. Let's continue. My name's Livia Bennett. I was 32 then, with a steady job managing a modest real estate office downtown, a job I took pride in, though it didn't bring in much more than enough to keep our small household ticking along. Mark, my husband, was a salesman with a silver tongue and a penchant for grand promises. We lived in a neat 2-bedroom house on the edge of town, the kind that looked better than it felt once you peeked behind the curtains. But it was home, or at least it was supposed to be. Life had a rhythm back then. I'd wake early, brew some tea, and settle behind my desk sorting through property listings and client files while Mark got ready for his day. We were ordinary, unremarkable, and content, or so I told myself. Sometimes, when the sun cast long shadows in the evening, I'd watch Mark from across the room and wonder if that flicker behind his eyes was a secret he kept locked away. But I was too busy managing leases and balancing budgets to pry. The first signs weren't dramatic. Small things, really. He came home late more often, muttering excuses about long meetings and new clients. He started guarding his phone like it was some precious relic. And then there was Bate, my closest friend since college, popping up in more and more of his stories. Not in passing mentions, but in laughter-filled evenings I wasn't invited to, whispered texts I wasn't meant to see, and smiles exchanged behind my back. The odd thing was, I felt a dull ache in my chest, but I never confronted either of them. Not yet. I told myself it was paranoia. After all, Mark was my husband. Bate was my friend. They wouldn't do such a thing, would they? Yet in the quiet moments when the house settled down for the night and I lay awake in the dark, I pieced together little fragments that didn't quite fit. A lipstick-stained coffee mug on the counter that wasn't mine. The faint scent of a perfume I hadn't seen in years. The soft buzz of messages on his phone while I pretended to read a book. But I didn't scream. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I watched and waited, silently gathering myself, as if preparing for some inevitable storm. You see, the thing about betrayal is it doesn't always announce itself with a bang. Sometimes it creeps in slow and steady, like a shadow stretching across a sunlit room. It unsettles the furniture, changes the air, and makes you question what you once believed. So I prepared, quietly. I began taking longer walks downtown, often passing the courthouse and the city offices where I might one day learn to fight back. I read articles about property law, divorce proceedings, and business management. I sharpened my skills at work, volunteering for extra tasks, building a network with local investors and developers. The real estate business was my anchor. It was the one thing I controlled. During those days, my silence was a shield. No words spilled out about my suspicions or my pain. Instead, I filled notebooks with names, dates, and odd incidents. I saved emails and texts that seemed innocuous but hinted at secret meetings and unexplained expenses. I tracked finances discreetly, noting how Mark's spending habits changed, the sudden business trips that lasted longer than usual. Bate, of course, continued her smiling charade. She dropped by with excuses about catching up, offering cups of coffee with the same sweetness she once showed me. But beneath her eyes was a flicker of guilt, or maybe just the thrill of deception. Mark, on the other hand, was oblivious, or so he thought. He boasted at the local bar about his pipeline of deals and scoffed when I mentioned the potential of investing in some of the properties I was eyeing. "A pipe dream," he'd sneer. "Real estate's a slow game, Livia. You're chasing shadows." His words only fueled my quiet determination. I wasn't naive. I knew the path ahead would be rocky. But I had a plan brewing, one built not on anger or revenge but on steady, deliberate action. By the time that fateful night arrived, when I finally saw the truth laid bare before me, I was ready. Not just to survive, but to rise. Because while Mark and Bate thought they were rewriting the story of our lives with their reckless betrayal, I was writing mine with the ink of patience, resilience, and quiet strength. That house, once a prison of broken promises, was about to become the launching pad of a dream they had mocked. And I was the only one who could make it real. That night remains etched in my memory like a deep scar, raw and unyielding. I had come home later than usual, a stack of contracts under my arm, my mind still tangled in the figures and possibilities of the properties I'd been nurturing. The house was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that presses heavy on your chest and makes every shadow loom larger. As I stepped inside, the air felt different, thicker, charged with an invisible tension. The dim light from the hallway revealed a scene I wasn't prepared for. Mark stood by the doorway, his face flushed not from work but something sharper, colder. Beside him was Bate. The same Bate I had laughed with, shared secrets, confided my dreams to. Now she stood there with a sly, triumphant smile, like a thief caught but proud of her spoils. I paused, clutching my papers tighter, feeling the sudden weight of betrayal settle in my bones. Mark cleared his throat, eyes avoiding mine. "Livia," he said, voice rough, "we need to talk." Bate's smile twisted as she added, "It's better if you hear it from us directly." I didn't move, didn't speak. I had rehearsed what I might say 1,000 times in the silence of my mind, but the moment refused to bend to my expectations. Instead, I watched them like a stranger watching a play she didn't want to be in. Mark swallowed hard. I'm leaving you, for Bate." The words hit me like a hammer, but there was no outcry from me, no wailing or rage. Only a quiet acceptance, as if I had already stepped into the shoes of someone who knew this day would come. Bate's eyes sparkled with something cruel. "We're tired of hiding it, Livia. You should just sign the papers and move on." I looked at her then, really looked. The woman who had once been my sister in everything but blood had become a stranger, a rival, a thief of my life's peace. For a moment the room felt so small it might collapse under the weight of what had been lost. Mark shoved a folder toward me, the divorce papers cold and official. "Sign them," he urged, "and we can settle this quickly." I studied the folder, the neat lines of text that spelled the end of years spent building a life, a dream, a family. My heart clenched, but my voice stayed buried deep inside. "Why?" I asked quietly, my voice steady but low. "Why did you choose her?" Mark blinked, caught off guard by the question. Bates sneered, "Why does it matter?" "It's over." I folded my arms, eyes sharp as a hawk's. "It matters because you betrayed everything we had: trust, friendship, love, and yet here you stand expecting me to walk away quietly." Mark shifted uncomfortably, but kept his composure. "It's just how things are now. You're stubborn, Livia, maybe you don't see it, but this is better for all of us." "Better," I echoed, voice rising. "Better for you and her, maybe, but what about me? The woman who built the foundation you're standing on." There was a flicker of something like regret, or was it guilt, in Mark's eyes. Then he sighed. "You never understood the way I think. You're too focused on your little empire to see the bigger picture." The bitterness in his tone ignited a fire inside me. I reached into my bag and pulled out a pen, my hand steady. "I'll sign," I said softly, "but don't mistake silence for weakness. I'm not walking away without making sure you remember who I am." Bate laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "You're just bitter because you lost." I smiled then, calm and cold. "No, Bate, I'm just getting started." They watched me sign the papers with that quiet fury that only those who have been underestimated know. I folded the folder carefully, stood up, and turned toward the door. "Goodbye," I said. "May your new life be as bright as you imagine." And with that, I left. The door clicked shut behind me, and I swallowed the sting of their betrayal like a medicine I had to endure. Walking away that night was not surrender. It was the first step in a journey I would take alone, but with my eyes wide open. I didn't need to scream to be heard. I didn't need to fight to be strong. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply keep your silence and prepare your next move, because the real story was just beginning. The days that followed the night I walked out were quiet, but they were anything but idle. I wasn't the sort of woman to let a betrayal like that unravel me into a puddle of tears or bitter complaints. No, I'd learned that life's harshest lessons often demanded the hardest work, not just to recover, but to rise higher than before. So while Mark and Bate reveled in their reckless new beginning, I set about gathering the tools I'd need for the next act of my life's story. I moved into a small apartment downtown, nothing fancy, but close enough to the courthouse, the city offices, and most importantly, the heartbeat of the real estate market I was determined to master. I spent long nights poring over legal books and business guides, memorizing clauses and regulations that could protect my interests. I knew better than to trust Mark's empty promises or Bates' false smiles. I needed proof, and I needed a plan. My first step was to dig deep into Mark's financial dealings. He was a salesman, sure, but also a man who liked to gamble with other people's money, often recklessly. I started by quietly requesting copies of our joint bank statements, tax returns, and property deeds, anything that tied his name to our shared assets. A few calls to the bank, a discreet chat with our accountant, and I began to unravel a tangled web of hidden debts, suspicious transfers, and empty promises that Mark had made to lenders and investors. There was a moment, poring over those documents late one evening, when a slow, cold realization dawned on me. Mark wasn't just walking away from me. He was walking away from responsibility, leaving behind a mountain of debts and broken contracts that I might have to face if I wasn't careful. And Bate, well, she was the enabler, the one who'd stood by his side as everything crumbled. I also tapped into my network, reaching out to people in the local real estate circles, investors, developers, lawyers. Many were sympathetic once I explained my situation in careful terms, others curious, some even skeptical. But one by one, doors opened. I found a seasoned attorney named Mr. Hargrove, a sharp-eyed man with a reputation for fighting tough battles and winning. We met over coffee one afternoon, and I laid out my case with calm resolve. "Mrs. Bennet," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you're sitting on a powder keg. From what you've shown me, Mark's left quite a mess. But if you play this right, you can not only protect yourself but turn this into an opportunity." His words ignited a spark. Opportunity, that's what I was after, not just survival but victory. With Mr. Hargrove's guidance, I began assembling the pieces: proof of Mark's infidelities, financial mismanagement, and breaches of our marital agreement. It wasn't easy. The more I dug, the more complicated it got. Mark was clever, hiding transactions in obscure accounts, using third parties to funnel money, all to keep his mess out of plain sight. But I was cleverer. I hired a private investigator, a quiet man named Jenkins, who specialized in uncovering secrets the kind of people like Mark thought they could bury forever. Jenkins brought me photographs, receipts, and logs that showed meetings between Mark and Bate, the signing of dubious contracts, even late-night visits to properties that Mark had claimed were sold, when in truth they were mortgaged or held as collateral for debts. The evidence piled up, layer upon layer, like bricks forming a wall I was building between me and ruin. One afternoon, Jenkins handed me a file fat with photos and documents. "Here's the good stuff," he said, his voice low. "If this doesn't convince a judge, nothing will." I nodded, feeling a surge of quiet triumph, but I didn't stop there. In the weeks that followed, I carefully documented every interaction, every missed payment, every broken promise. I kept a journal, noting the dates and times of calls, the tone of voices, the promises made and broken. When Bates' calls came, half apologies, half threats, I recorded them too. I wasn't just gathering evidence for court. I was building a fortress of facts around myself. Meanwhile, my business began to grow. I invested cautiously but confidently in properties Mark had once mocked. I negotiated deals with patience and persistence, turning small profits that I plowed back into new ventures. I took on clients who respected my honesty and vision, earning their trust through every handshake and signed contract. It was during one of these meetings that my assistant, Grace, noticed something unusual. "Livia," she said one day, tapping her finger on a report, "you're not just surviving this, you're building an empire." I smiled, but I kept my guard up. Grace didn't know the full story yet, but she'd soon learn that every brick of that empire was laid on the foundation of patience, resilience, and careful strategy. As the months rolled by, the pieces of my plan came together. The debts Mark had run up were dragging him down. His reckless promises to investors were coming due, and his new life with Bate was unraveling under the weight of unpaid bills and broken contracts. But I remained focused, silent as a shadow in the background, waiting for the moment to strike. I wasn't the woman who had signed those papers in quiet defeat. I was something new, something stronger. And when the time came, Mark and Bate would see just how wrong they'd been to underestimate me. Because sometimes, the most dangerous weapon a betrayed woman has isn't anger or tears. It's the steady, unyielding power of preparation. And I was ready. The day I'd been preparing for, the day when quiet patience met undeniable power, finally arrived with the weight of a storm breaking. Mark, once smug and untouchable, was about to learn that his recklessness had consequences. But I wasn't going to deliver this lesson with bitterness or shrill accusations. No, my way was a chess game, calculated, sharp, and utterly unexpected. I sat across from him in the sleek conference room of the downtown law offices where Mr. Hargrove had arranged our meeting. The air was heavy with anticipation, but my hands lay calm on the table. Mark looked different, tired, brittle, as if the man who'd once mocked my dreams was shrinking under the weight of the truth I now wielded. Bate was there too, sitting a few seats away, her forced smile faltering as she realized this wasn't going to be the casual confrontation she'd imagined. She glanced at Mark, seeking reassurance, but found none. Mr. Hargrove opened a thick folder and slid it toward Mark. "Mr. Bennett," he said with measured authority, "this dossier contains evidence of your financial mismanagement, fraudulent activities, and infidelity. We've documented everything, from forged documents to suspicious transactions, to communications proving your breach of the marital agreement." Mark's face paled as he rifled through the papers, eyes darting across photographs, bank statements, and recorded conversations. This is impossible," he stammered. "It's very real," I said, my voice steady, "and it's just the beginning." Bate scoffed. "You think throwing papers around will save you? Livia, this is nothing but spite." I met her gaze, icy and unyielding. "Spite? No, Bate, this is justice. You and Mark gambled with my life and my future. I'm here to collect." Mark clenched his jaw. "You don't understand the risks I took for us. You're too blind to see the big picture." "The only picture I see is the one of betrayal," I replied, leaning forward. "You left debts in your wake that you can't pay, investors are suing. Creditors are knocking, and I'm left cleaning the mess while you're playing house with Bate." For a moment, the room was silent except for the hum of the city outside. Then Mr. Hargrove added, "We have sufficient grounds to pursue legal action for damages, division of assets, and enforcement of the fidelity clause in the marital contract." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Fidelity clause, that's expired." "Oh, it hasn't," I said with a quiet smile. "You might want to read the fine print next time." Bates' eyes widened in disbelief, but I could see the cracks forming in their armor. Mark, desperate, leaned forward. "Livia, listen, let's settle this privately. We can work something out." I shook my head slowly. "Too late for that, you gambled on my silence. I'm here to cash in." At that moment, the doors to the conference room burst open. A man I hadn't seen before stepped in, a representative from one of Mark's largest creditors. "Mr. Bennett," he said gravely, "we're calling in your loans. Bankruptcy proceedings will begin next week if payments aren't made." Mark's face drained of color. He turned to me, eyes pleading. "Livia, I never meant for it to get this far." I met his gaze without hesitation. "Well, Mark, you should have thought about that before you destroyed everything." Bate whispered something, a mixture of fear and frustration, but the words fell on deaf ears. I was no longer the woman they could intimidate or dismiss. After hours of negotiations, the meeting ended with an agreement. Mark would relinquish claims to our shared assets, including the properties I'd quietly secured. The fidelity clause ensured he'd pay substantial damages, and the bankruptcy proceedings would limit his financial mobility. As we left the building, Grace, my assistant, caught my arm. "That was incredible," she said, eyes shining. "You were calm, confident, like you knew every step before it happened." I smiled softly. "Years of preparation, Grace, that's the difference between survival and victory." Driving home that evening, I felt an unfamiliar lightness. The weight of betrayal hadn't vanished, but it no longer crushed me. Instead, it fueled a fire, a determination to build something unbreakable. Later, when Mark called, begging for forgiveness and offering empty apologies, I was ready. "Mark," I said firmly, "I don't hate you, but I don't need you anymore." And with that, I hung up. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in fighting, but in standing firm, letting the truth and preparation do the work. That day, I didn't just confront betrayal, I reclaimed my power. And I made sure they never forgot the woman they thought was weak. The days after the confrontation were a whirlwind, not the chaos of panic, but the focused energy of a woman who'd set her course and refused to waver. I had drawn my lines in the sand, and now it was time to step fully into the life I was building, brick by brick, deal by deal. With Mark's claims to our assets relinquished, I gained control over properties that had once been nothing but dreams whispered in the quiet corners of my mind. The debts he left behind were being swallowed up by the bankruptcy proceedings, shielding me from their reach. It was like the heavy fog that had hung over me was finally lifting, revealing a horizon ripe with possibility. I returned to my office early each morning, greeted by Grace's cheerful "good morning," as she sorted through emails and contracts. Our team was small but dedicated, and every day we pushed a little further, explored new opportunities, and secured fresh investments. I was no longer just a manager. I was an owner, a strategist, a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. One afternoon, as we reviewed the plans for a newly acquired apartment complex on the outskirts of town, Grace looked up, her eyes wide with excitement. "Livia," she said, "this project could change everything. The market's shifting, and if we play our cards right, this'll be the crown jewel. I smiled, feeling a warmth that had little to do with business and everything to do with the journey I'd taken. You're right, I said, but it's more than just the market. It's about proving that no setback is the end, only the start of something new. That evening, I sat alone in my modest apartment, the soft glow of the city lights streaming through the window. The silence was no longer heavy, it was peaceful. I reached for my phone and opened a message from a longtime client who'd heard about my recent successes. Livia, it read, we want you to manage our new portfolio. Your reputation speaks for itself. It was more than a contract, it was validation, but it wasn't all easy. There were moments when the past tried to creep back in, old fears, doubts whispered in the dark. Sometimes I caught myself wondering if I'd ever be free from the shadow Mark and Bate had cast. Yet each time, I reminded myself of the evidence gathered, the legal victories, and the empire slowly taking shape beneath my hands. One evening, Grace and I sat over coffee at a quiet cafe, talking not just about work but about dreams and resilience. Livia, she said softly, how did you do it? Stay so calm when everything was falling apart. I looked out the window for a moment, then met her gaze. It wasn't calm at first, I admitted, but I learned that silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. I chose to listen, to prepare, to act only when the time was right. And when I did, I was unstoppable. Grace nodded thoughtfully. You turned pain into power. That's the lesson, I said. We can't control what others do, but we can control how we respond. And sometimes, the greatest strength is in rising without making a sound until you're ready to roar. Business flourished. Offers came in, partnerships formed, and my portfolio expanded beyond what I'd dared imagine during those lonely nights of doubt. The real estate empire I'd quietly built began to draw attention. Investors, developers, even competitors took note of the woman who'd once been dismissed as chasing a pipe dream. The first tangible signs of victory were more than financial. Confidence blossomed within me, a fierce and steady flame that no betrayal could extinguish. I found myself mentoring younger women in business, sharing lessons not just about property deals, but about resilience, strategy, and the quiet power of preparation. Mark, on the other hand, faded into whispers of bankruptcy court and failed ventures. His phone calls stopped coming. The man who once held my world in his hands was now a distant memory. One day, as I walked through a bustling construction site, a familiar voice came from behind. Livia. I turned to see an old colleague, Jake, who'd been a mentor early in my career. You've come a long way, he said, smiling. I always knew you had it in you. Thanks, Jake, I replied, the pride in my chest warming my words. Sometimes the hardest storms bring out the strongest trees. As the sun set over the skyline, painting the buildings gold, I felt a deep sense of peace. The woman who had signed those divorce papers in silence was gone. In her place stood someone who had reclaimed her life, her dreams, and her power, not with noise or fury, but with unwavering resolve. And this was only the beginning. Mark's world unraveled faster than anyone expected. His bankruptcy filings became public record, and investors who once praised him turned their backs in disappointment. The creditors hounded him relentlessly, freezing accounts and seizing assets. Meanwhile, Bates' support wavered as reality sank in. There was no easy escape from the wreckage they'd caused. In contrast, my own life blossomed. The properties I'd acquired flourished under careful management, turning modest profits into a steady stream of income. Word spread about the woman who'd built a real estate empire from the ashes of betrayal, and with each success, my confidence deepened. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. Legal proceedings confirmed my rights. The fidelity clause in our marital contract proved a powerful tool, ensuring Mark paid damages that bolstered my investments. The courts recognized my meticulous evidence, validating the careful work I'd done long before the confrontation. The division of assets favored me decisively, cementing my control over what had once been our shared dreams. Relationships shifted too. Old friends and business contacts who had doubted me began seeking partnership. Younger women looked to me as a mentor, inspired by my story of resilience. Grace grew alongside me, her loyalty and hard work rewarded with a stake in the company. One afternoon, as we signed a new development deal, Grace looked up with a grin. Livia, remember when this was just a dream no one took seriously? I laughed softly, and now it's a reality they can't ignore. Mark's calls stopped altogether. When news reached me that he'd moved away, his reputation in ruins, I felt neither anger nor pity. only the quiet satisfaction that justice had been served. I stood taller, freer. The empire that had once been mocked as a pipe dream was now my legacy, built on patience, strategy, and unwavering strength. The past no longer chained me, it had forged me. The past, once a shadow clinging to me like a second skin, has finally lifted. I now live in a home truly my own, surrounded by the skyline of buildings I helped create, each one a monument to endurance, patience, and quiet strength. The woman who once signed those papers in silence has transformed into someone new, confident, independent, and fiercely alive. Each morning I wake with a sense of purpose. I am no longer burdened by what was lost but inspired by what lies ahead. My empire grows steadily, but more importantly, I have built a life rich in meaning, mentoring young women, investing in communities, and proving that resilience can turn heartbreak into triumph. I've learned that success isn't just measured in profits, but in the legacy you leave behind and the lives you touch. When friends and even strangers ask me how I managed to rise from such deep betrayal, I tell them simply, I stayed silent long enough to listen, prepared while others faltered, and acted only when the time was right. Strength is not loud, it's steady. There are moments I still reflect on the woman I was, the fear, the doubt, the quiet suffering. But those moments no longer define me. Instead, they remind me how far I've come and fuel the fire to keep moving forward. The future remains unwritten, wide open, and full of promise. There are new ventures to explore, new challenges to face, and dreams still unfolding. I carry lessons forged in fire, wisdom about patience, the power of preparation, and the strength found in calm resolve. I've also found peace in forgiveness, not for them, but for me. Letting go of bitterness has allowed me to embrace joy and possibility fully. The scars remain, but they no longer hurt. They have become my badges of honor. Mark's chapter is closed, folded away like a worn-out book. Mine is just beginning, filled with blank pages waiting for the stories I'll write with courage and grace. And for anyone standing at the edge of despair, unsure if they can go on, I hope my story whispers this truth. Sometimes, the quietest voice carries the most unstoppable power. Keep steady, prepare well, and when your moment comes, don't hesitate to rise.